listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me, non-judgmental talk about infidelity with Dr. Marie Murphy. If you're looking for new perspectives on complicated relationship issues, you've come to the right place.
Days go by, they're crawling by.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Marie Murphy. I'm a relationship coach and I help people who are engaging in anything they think counts as infidelity to deal with their feelings, clarify what they want, and make decisions about what they're going to do. No shame, no blame, no judgments. I know that your infidelity situation may seem like a complicated mess, but I promise you that if you are willing to learn new ways of approaching it, you can resolve your infidelity situation in a way that you feel great about. And I can help you do that. I am here to teach you concepts and tools that make dealing with your infidelity situation a whole lot simpler and a whole lot easier. You do not have to stay stuck in your status quo for any longer. Together, we will find you some relief and a clear path forward, and we can get started on that today. There are two ways we can work together. You can work with me one-on-one, and if you're interested in that, go to the services page of my website, mariemurphyphd.com/services, and book yourself an introductory coaching session with me. Or you can purchase my self-guided course called You're Not the Only One. You're Not the Only One contains teachings and assignments that are based on all of the expertise I've developed over the course of helping hundreds of clients deal with their infidelity situations. And these teachings are available to you in an online portal that you can access 24/7. Head over to the services page of my website to access You're Not the Only One with just a few clicks of your mouse. Now, if you're wondering what's happened to the group version of You're Not the Only One that I've been talking about for the last several months now, my answer is I killed it. I put an end to it. I totally killed my baby. And I'm going to tell you all about why I decided to do this in a podcast episode in the not too distant future, because the story of why I chose to shut down my group program so soon after launching it has many parallels to infidelity situations. But as excited as I am to tell you that whole story, I'm not going to do it today. For today's purposes, just know that if you're looking for my group program, it no longer exists, but you can learn about the two ways you can work with me on the services page of my website, mariemurphyphd.com/services. Okay, today I'm going to tell you the first part of the story of how I came to do the work I do. As you may be aware, non-judgmental infidelity coach is not like a job description that exists out there in the world, at least not to my knowledge. As far as I know, this thing that I do is pretty unique. I honestly do not know any other professionals, coaches or otherwise, who are dedicated to offering non-judgmental guidance to people who are actively cheating or actively engaging in any kind of infidelity. There are, of course, plenty of professionals who work with infidelity in other ways or from other angles, such as, for example, helping couples repair their relationship after one person has cheated. But as far as I know, my angle on helping people with infidelity is pretty unique. Now, having said that, there are about 8 billion people on the planet these days, so I would not be at all surprised if there were, in fact, other people out there doing work that's very similar to what I do. But as of now, I don't know any of them. So my point here is, it's not like when I was 5 years old, somebody sat me down and said, one day when you grow up, you can be an astronaut or an accountant or a teacher or a plumber or a chemist or an architect. Or you can be a non-judgmental infidelity coach. That did not happen. Nothing even remotely like that ever happened. This is a job that I created for myself out of thin air, so to speak. And that's part of the reason why I'm telling you the story of how I came to do what I do. A lot of my clients are pretty sure that they're going to have to make some big changes in their lives in order to resolve their infidelity situations in ways that they truly feel good about. And many of my clients are like, I don't know if the future that I want for myself is even possible. I don't know anyone who has done what I want to do. I don't know if I'm allowed to reconfigure my life in the way that I want to. And if I can even dare to make the changes that I would really love to make, I don't know if other people in my life will respond well to those changes. Here's the thing, people. Sometimes nobody gives us a roadmap. Sometimes we don't get to see examples of other people having done the things we want to do before we try to do them. Sometimes the only way to get what we want is to dare to want it and to dare to believe it's possible and to be willing to take one brave step forward at a time. And that's more or less what I had to do to get to the point of doing the work I do today, which I love very much, and making a living out of it. And that's the main reason why I'm going to tell you this story, because quite honestly, I don't love talking at great length about my own history these days, especially not publicly. And there are several reasons for that. For one thing, I'm not a memoirist. Skillfully telling a story of yourself requires some skill. And I don't necessarily have those skills, or at least I certainly don't have any formal training in writing memoir. I read lots of memoirs, but I don't write them. Also, when you put any stories of yourself out there, they're out there, and people get to interpret them however they want to. And that's fine and fair, and that's just the way it works. But putting yourself out there and then being misinterpreted can be uncomfortable, and that's a discomfort that I often try to avoid. I've also been reluctant to put forth any sort of explanation of why I do what I do or how I got to doing what I do, because, as Mary Karr writes at the outset of Lit, one of her memoirs, any way I tell this story is a lie. Any way I tell this story is a lie. And what I think that speaks to is the fact that any story we tell about our lives is an act of creation, not a neutral reflection of a set of literal or absolute truths. And even though I don't think that's a good reason to hold back on telling our stories, because stories give life richness and meaning, it has been a reason why I've held back on telling some of my own stories. Because, for better or worse, I don't particularly like being reduced to one version of my own narrative. One version of the narrative is just one version of the narrative. That doesn't mean that one version of the narrative isn't important, but it certainly isn't the only truth. And being reduced to one version of your truth can be a very unpleasant thing indeed. And on top of that, when it comes to the question of why I am the way I am or why I do the work I do, I don't think there need to be any definitive answers. God damn it. Thank you very much. It's kind of like eating a great pureed soup, a great blended soup. I love soup, by the way. I love blended soup. And when I'm eating a great blended soup, I don't really care about each individual ingredient that went into it. What I care about is the excellent soup that I get to eat has turned into something that is far more than the sum of its parts through an alchemical process that I don't fully understand and I don't need to understand. I don't need to know exactly how long the squash was roasted for in order to enjoy the hell out of eating a squash soup. I don't need to know exactly what spices went into the soup. Because even if I did, what if it was the secret ingredient that was added to the stock that was used as the soup's base that makes the soup so particularly delicious, not any of the spices that went into the soup? And I think about the work I do as the soup I've made out of a lot of different pieces of my personal history and my professional training and experience. And as I'm going about my business every day, I don't don't feel much inclination to attempt to tell the story of how the soup got made. I just keep on making the soup. I just keep on dishing out the soup, right? My work is the soup I've made. And to me, it seems like the final product is the point, not the ingredients that went into it or the recipe I followed. And spoiler alert, I definitely wasn't following a recipe to make this soup. However, even though I have been and still am rather reluctant to attempt to put together a coherent narrative of how I got to doing the work I do, I am also fully aware that I shut myself off from being fully known when I withhold stories of who I am and why I do what I do. Even if any story we tell is just one version of the truth, when we don't allow ourselves to share any versions of our truths, we may not do ourselves any great favors. And I say this in part because I think it's something very important for all of us to keep in mind. We all have our right to privacy. It's never incumbent upon us to tell any of our stories or all of our stories. I firmly believe that we are allowed to keep things to ourselves. But of course, there's always a but. There's always another side to the coin. And that is this in this case. If we don't share of ourselves, then we may not have to deal with getting our story wrong and the telling of it. If we don't tell our stories, we may not have to deal with our stories being misinterpreted. But we may also rob ourselves of the opportunity to be known and seen and understood and appreciated and connected to others. When we don't share of ourselves, we may not be able to forge the connections with others that we desperately want to have in ways that we otherwise might. Once upon a time when I lived in San Diego, I volunteered at this place called Being Alive, which was a support center for low-income people living with HIV and AIDS. And it was a marvelous place in so many ways. But the point is that when I volunteered there, I was doing body work, and they had this big, glorious room devoted to the bodywork sessions. And in that room, there was a poster on the wall that said, "He who conceals his disease cannot expect to be healed." And the poster called that an African proverb and didn't get any more specific about the source of that quote or idea. He who conceals his disease cannot expect to be healed. It's an interesting thing to consider. But to reiterate, I think there is kind of a Goldilocks and the Three Bears approach here, right? There's a difference between sharing not enough of ourselves, maybe just the right amount of ourselves or something close to that, and sharing too much of ourselves. And we all get to decide where we draw those lines or strike those balances. And it's interesting, for all of my talk about being reluctant to talk about how I got to doing the work I do, there was definitely a time in my life when I loved to tell people about myself. I am quite confident that at least some people at some points in time would have considered me an oversharer, right? I'm sure there were some people who were totally sick of hearing me tell stories about myself. And then the pendulum swung in the opposite direction. And these days I talk about myself a whole lot less than I used to. And there's a lot I could say about that, but the important point for our purposes of this. People sometimes ask me why I do the work I do or how I got into this professional niche of mine. And I think that these are pretty reasonable questions to ask or things to wonder about, right? If I were someone else, I would probably want to know how I got to doing the work I do. And when people ask me these kinds of questions, I am deeply, profoundly embarrassed by the answers I typically give. I usually nervously mumble these totally nonsensical responses. I was interviewed for this TV thing about infidelity a couple of years ago, and I don't think I'm supposed to say what it was, but at any rate, the TV show exists, but they didn't use my interview in the finished product. And when I found out that I was not going to be featured in the actual finished product, I was so relieved because the interviewer had asked me how I got to doing the work I do. And I don't remember exactly what I said in response, but I do remember thinking that the answer I gave was absolutely terrible. And I remember thinking that if the segment of my interview had shown up on an actual television program that people could watch, I would have been really, really sad about presenting myself and my professional story in such an unsatisfying way. Unsatisfying to me, at least. So that's the second reason why I'm telling the story of how I got to do what I do. I think it's very reasonable for people to ask about why I do what I do, and I'd really like to give a better answer to that question than I have in the past. And a third reason why I'm telling you the story of how I got to doing this work I currently do is because it is fundamentally a story of me learning how to be faithful to myself. And me learning how to create something that I wanted to exist, but did not yet exist. And as the emotion in my voice probably indicates, this was a big fucking deal for me. And those aspects of my story are deeply relevant to many of my clients and many of my listeners' experiences of dealing with their infidelity situations. So, with all of that said, let us begin at the beginning. Once upon a time, I was little. And from the time I was very young, it was abundantly clear to me that some people, such as my parents, had pretty loaded ideas about anything related to sexuality and sex and relationships and people's bodies and family formations and stuff like that. There was some strange energy associated with these topics in my household. And this was very noticeable to me, even when I was really pretty quite young, right? And then, of course, the AIDS epidemic began when I was young. So it's not like my parents were the only people out there who were kind of freaked out about anything related to sex or sexuality or relationships or bodies and the like. It was part of the cultural moment in time when I was a little kid. Now, whenever I tell people about these early understandings of mine, they usually say things like, "How did you pick up on this stuff when you were so young? Why was I so sensitive to the special significance associated with sex-related stuff when I was little? Why did I pick up on the stigma in the air when, for example, anything related to gay people came up?" Important side note here, folks. Remember, this was decades ago. In human years, I think it's fair to say I'm still in my mid-40s. So things were a little different when I was little. Homophobia was alive and well when I was young. It's okay to be gay was not a thing when I was in preschool or elementary school or even high school. There's a lot more I could say about that, but I'll end that side note right here. We are talking about like the late 70s, early and mid 80s when I was a little kid, right? So why did I pick up on what I'm calling the special significance associated with sexuality when I was so young? On the one hand, who knows? Who cares? Some young kids are super interested in dinosaurs, and then they grow up to be paleontologists. Some little kids love art, and they grow up and become artists. Some kids develop an interest in spaceships when they are like 3 days old. Some little kids start skiing before most kids can walk, right? Little humans have the capacity to become attuned to all sorts of things or become interested in all sorts of things. And I just happened to become aware that stigma related to sexuality and all the things related to sexuality was a thing when I was pretty young. But having said that, there may be another sort of answer to the question of why or how I was attuned to and interested in this kind of stuff from a very young age, and I promise I will tell you more about that later. Anyway, this theme continued as I grew up. I noticed that a lot of people thought all things related to sex were a pretty big deal. A big deal in different ways, a big deal for different reasons, and sometimes it struck me as a little odd, right? Or a little disproportionate. Later in life, in graduate school, I immersed myself in the sociology of sexuality. And one of the operating premises of the sociology of sexuality is that sexuality is an incredibly important aspect of social life and very worthy of study. And sexuality is also a very mundane aspect of social life. In other words, of course, sexuality is a big deal because everything humans do can be considered a big deal, but it's not an especially big deal. Simultaneously, as I was growing up, I was also getting a pretty good understanding of the various ways that sexuality and sex and love and relationships could be important in people's lives, important aspects of people's lives, and important in really different ways. I read a lot when I was little, and I read a lot of things that I probably wasn't supposed to be reading. And this provided me with a tremendous education. And this was all before the internet, of course, right? When I was young, also, I think, I was interested in the nuances of adult life in a way that it didn't seem like other kids were. I'm speculating, of course, but I certainly did pick up on some things related to adult relationships that were of interest to me. And so this just sort of, set the tone of how I thought about the world and set the tone for the kinds of things I was interested in. Fast forward to the first semester of my freshman year of high school. That semester, I had to take a class called Living Skills or Skills for Living or something like that. And on the whole, it was not a terrific experience. But there was a rather lengthy sex education unit within that class. And strangely enough, it was pretty great. Whoever devised the class had the good sense to bring in an array of teachers and guest speakers to talk about various sexuality-related topics. So it wasn't just one person delivering one sort of message to us. I think the quote-unquote regular teacher or the teacher that taught the class consistently over the semester taught us some stuff, like maybe some basic physiology stuff, reproductive biology stuff. But we were exposed to other voices and other perspectives too. We had peer educators, meaning high school students who were just a few years older than we were, come in and talk about safe sex and HIV and STI transmission prevention. We had speakers who were living with AIDS come in and talk to us about their experiences. We had gay people come in and say basically, hey, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. What do you want to ask me about my alternative lifestyle, right? I say that somewhat ironically, but this was by then, I guess, the early 90s, and it was still pretty normal for people to be overtly homophobic. I can clearly remember the looks on some of my classmates' faces when there was a gay man with AIDS sitting right there in front of us, telling us about how he and his lovers found ways to have safer sex after his initial HIV diagnosis. And some of the students in class were totally freaked out and made no attempt to hide that. But I loved it. I loved these humans coming to our class and telling us about their sexual identities and their sex lives and being so willing to present a version of life beyond the heteronormative bulwark. Something about all of this felt normal and right to me. I loved the man who was brave enough to show up in a room full of homophobic high school students who were still afraid that you could get AIDS from a toilet seat and look all of us in the eye without a hint of shame or shyness. There was not a whole lot that I loved about high school, but I really fucking loved it that they managed to provide us with a varied and nuanced sex education. One day within the sex education unit of this Skills for Living class, we had another substitute teacher who was this older European woman, and I'm not sure what she was supposed to be teaching us about, but she ended up talking about sexual pleasure, and somehow she got on the subject of women's experiences of heterosexual sex, or more specifically, women's experiences of penile penetration. And she just started talking about having that kind of sex while a woman was menstruating, and half the room just lost it. At least half of the students were like, oh my God, that's so gross. Like, just freaking out. And God bless this woman. She did not flinch. She did not bat an eye. She didn't take these kids' discomfort seriously at all. She just kind of looked at us like, what's the big deal? And said, yeah, some women even experience more pleasure from sexual intercourse when they're menstruating. And if you just put towels down, it's no big deal. She was so matter of fact with us, and she treated us like little adults, even though at least half of the class was obviously not on her wavelength at all. I felt such a profound sense of gratitude to her for being willing to talk to us about sex as if we were just a bunch of reasonable people talking about something that was simultaneously important and unremarkable. The overall effect of the sex education segment of this Skills for Living class, or whatever it was called, was that I finally had concrete evidence that sex and sexuality and relationships and bodies could be talked about in a non-weird way. This, I don't want to say too much about, but was very much in contrast to how things were in the household I grew up in. Right? And so this was a very welcome contrast to me indeed. Having living proof that it was possible to talk about all of this stuff as if it were important, but not loaded with stigma or taboo or a bunch of weirdness was a tremendous, profound revelation for me. And I decided that I wanted to be part of that effort. I decided that I wanted to be on these people's team, the team of people who could talk about sex-related things as if they were important, but not particularly remarkable. Part of me was just like, all right, let me do this. Let me be this. This is so important, and I want to help with this. And then from there, sort of intentionally and sort of unintentionally, I became a resource for various sorts of information among my friends. I became that person who people would come to and say, I don't know where my clitoris is, or I don't know how to find someone else's clitoris, or I had unprotected sex last night. What should I do? Or I think I'm gay and I don't know what to do with that. Or I know I'm gay and I don't know how to tell people that, etc., etc., etc. Remember, people, you couldn't just Google this stuff back then, right? Having a copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves was kind of a big deal. And I had enough knowledge to actually be helpful a lot of times when people came to me. But what was really clear was that people didn't just need information. Yes, they needed information for sure, but they needed to be able to talk to someone who had the right kind of presence and the right quality of approach to the subject matter at hand. And I already knew from my own experiences that that was pretty hard to find. And I had the sense that I just might be able to be something of an antidote to all of the weird, gnarly stigma surrounding all things related to sexuality. And I took the opportunity to be helpful in this way very seriously. Later in high school, I was formally trained as a peer sexual and reproductive health educator. And then I myself went to high school classrooms in my school district and co-taught classes on safe sex. And that was so much fun and so terrific in so many ways. I also, when I was in high school, did HIV prevention street outreach, which basically involved going up to complete strangers and asking them if they would like to take a sex survey, and then talking to them about their sexual practices and offering them materials and information and referrals to various different resources if they wanted them. And as you might imagine, you learn a lot by talking to strangers about their sex lives. Among other things, you learn how to help a diverse array of people quickly feel comfortable talking about something they might not ordinarily feel comfortable talking about. You learn how to set a particular tone. You learn how to ask very direct questions, which could be interpreted as invasive questions, in a very respectful way. You learn a lot about what stands in the way of people talking about sex or getting condoms when they need them or getting screened for sexually transmissible infections when they need to. You learn a lot about what prevents people from having conversations with their partners about sex. You learn a lot about why people don't want to talk to their doctors about sex. And over and over and over again, you learn how important it is to talk about sex and things related to sex in an open, non-judgmental way, or at least that's what I learned from Safe Sex Street Outreach. And of course, these experiences augmented my sense that it was really important to me to create these kinds of opportunities for communicating about things related to sexuality. If I were a simpler person, I probably would have just gone off to college, set my sights on becoming a sexual health educator of some sort, found a job of that nature, and lived happily ever after. But that is not what I did. I did double major in sociology and human sexuality studies as an undergraduate. Well, sort of. That's partially true. I found out a week before graduation that I had enough credits to qualify for a double major, but the deadline for filling out the paperwork for an official double major had long passed, so I think my diploma says that I majored in sociology and minored in human sexuality studies. But who cares? Anyway, the point is, my studies certainly lined up with my interests, but for various reasons, I didn't want to pursue what might have seemed like a pretty obvious career path as a sexual health educator or a sex therapist or something like that. And part of the reason was that I had gotten bedazzled by academia. In some ways, it sounds hilarious to say that about myself now, but at the time, my infatuation was very earnest and very sincere. Going from doing sex education to the academic study of sexuality and related aspects of social life was downright intoxicating. Even though I am really glad that I eventually escaped academia, I don't regret a moment of the time and energy I invested into it. The rich traditions, sociological and otherwise, of studying sexuality and love and relationships and bodies and pleasures are compelling and brilliant, and I'm proud to have engaged with and contributed to those fields of study. My engagement with the academic study of sexuality and related aspects of social life informs my approach to coaching immeasurably. Okay, keeping the story moving here. After I finished my undergraduate degree, I wanted more work experience in the realm of people's experiences with sexuality and love and relationships with family. And I wanted more work experience with dealing with the stigma that's sometimes associated with love and sexuality or different manifestations thereof. I didn't want to just work with people directly, as in, say, providing sexual health education to individuals or groups, although that was still of interest to me. I wanted a deeper understanding of the broader social systems that enabled and constrained people to live out their romantic and sexual lives in ways that they could reasonably consider happy and healthy. And so that's what I did. I pursued those kinds of work experiences, that is. I served in the Peace Corps in Zambia, and although my work there was not exclusively devoted to sexual and reproductive health and HIV education and things in that realm, that was certainly a part of it. And all of my work in Zambia gave me great insight into the ways in which social forces create stigma and silence around sexuality, and great insights into the consequences of that stigma and silence for individuals and communities. And then after the Peace Corps, I had a job in international reproductive health education. And in that role, I learned a lot about how even people and organizations that are ostensibly dedicated to destigmatizing certain aspects of sexuality may also pretty actively stigmatize other dimensions of sexuality. When I had this job, our primary collaborators were based in the Philippines, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, and Ethiopia. And I will never forget this moment when I was at this international conference, standing next to one of my colleagues from the Philippines, who are just speaking passionately about the importance of talking more publicly about different types of contraception and how to use different types of contraception and how to talk about the body parts involved in using different types of contraception. Then turning around in the next breath and saying homosexuality is a sin and that's just all there is to it. It might have been something related to condom use. I don't remember. And on the one hand, in this moment, I was crushed. I was like, do you not see any irony here? Do you not see how it might be beneficial to apply some of the same radical openness that you apply to birth control to expressions of sexuality other than heterosexuality? But on the other hand, I understood. She was coming from the cultural context of a very Catholic country that had certain widely shared views on diversity of sexual orientation. So it wasn't that I was blaming her specifically for anything. She was just an example of a bigger issue. And this bigger issue concerned me a lot, or I should say interested me a lot. How do we, as professionals who are supposedly helping people live out their sex lives in a way that makes sense for them, do right by others if we're not willing to accept that humans do all kinds of things in their love lives and sex lives, including things that we may personally find objectionable? What exactly do we think we're going to accomplish when we try to wish certain aspects of the human experience out of existence? Or when we try to ignore certain aspects of the human experience out of existence? These kinds of questions weighed on me a lot, and these are some of the questions that propelled me to pursue a PhD in sociology and, kept me very busy for many years as a graduate student. And in a sense, what I got out of graduate school was great. Studying and researching and teaching about sexuality and love and relationships and family from a sociological perspective is work that I believe this world really needs. And I think that having approached sexuality from a sociological perspective to the extent that I have is part of what enables me to conceptualize infidelity in the ways that I do and help people deal with their infidelity situations in the ways that I do. And graduate school was also hell in many ways, but more about that later. Some of the key insights and fundamental premises of the sociology of sexuality that I think it's useful for everyone to know about are as follows. Number one, sexuality is an important aspect of social life, of human life, but it isn't especially important. I said this earlier. Sexuality is worthy of rigorous inquiry, just like any other aspect of human social life is. But it isn't inherently imbued with any special significance. Number two, even though sexuality isn't inherently imbued with any special significance, humans have indeed assigned special significance to all things related to sex and sexuality for centuries. Put a little differently, sexuality and all things related to it have been considered loaded or taboo topics by many cultures and societies. And of course, particular expressions of sexuality have been deemed especially taboo or have been extra stigmatized. In other words, stigma associated with sexuality can be considered a social fact, what sociologists call a social fact, even if it is not a fact that sexuality is inherently worthy of stigma. Number three, humans do all kinds of things when it comes to their sex lives, romantic lives, relationship lives, love lives. We may have ideas about what's quote unquote normal or quote unquote appropriate, but these ideas about what people should or shouldn't be doing are not reflections of what people are actually doing in these areas of their lives. Quite simply, research shows that there is tremendous diversity in how people live out their sexuality and their sex lives and their love lives and their relationship lives. And the historical record demonstrates that this diversity has been present in human sex lives for quite a long time. 4, Our shared ideas about what is sexually normal or abnormal, appropriate or inappropriate, healthy or unhealthy have tremendous consequences. Collectively and individually, being on the receiving end of sexual stigma matters a lot. Having whatever you're doing deemed abnormal or inappropriate or unhealthy may have significant consequences for you. 5, some of the ways that we collectively sanction people from departing from what is considered normal or appropriate expressions of sexuality or love or relationships are pretty overt and unsubtle and maybe pretty easy to spot. And some of the ways we collectively sanction or denigrate so-called abnormal expressions of love and sexuality in relationships are really subtle and insidious. 6, our ideas about what counts as normal or abnormal sexuality, healthy or unhealthy expressions of sexuality, or appropriate and inappropriate expressions of sexuality are social constructions, meaning that humans have come up with these ideas through social interactions and negotiations. And that's not to say that all of our ideas about what counts as good or bad expressions of sexuality are totally useless. Just because ideas are human constructions doesn't mean they don't have any value. For instance, many people, not all people, but many people, share the idea that non-consensual sex is not okay. And we've set up laws to sanction non-consensual sex, or at least we've attempted to set up laws sanctioning non-consensual sex. And I'm all in favor of this. I'm all in favor of saying that non-consensual sex is not okay and that we collectively ought to do what we can to prevent it and sanction it. So the point of saying that our ideas about sexuality are socially constructed is not to say that because these ideas are constructed by humans, we can ignore them or anything should be considered okay or anything and everything ought to be considered equally acceptable. The point isn't that we should do away with all norms regarding sexual behavior, right? Rather, the point is that it is we as humans who are the ones making up what's considered acceptable and unacceptable. It's not God or nature or any single or absolute source that dictates the rules about what's okay within the realm of sexuality and love and relationships and what is not. There are many more important insights from the sociology of sexuality that I'd love to share with you, but those 6 are a pretty good start. As far as I'm concerned, these are the kinds of operating assumptions we want to be working from if we are going to help humans figure out how they want to navigate their sexual/romantic/love/relationship lives. And so, in a sense, being immersed in these understandings of human sexuality within the context of my graduate training was great for me insofar as they later informed my capacity to help people deal with their infidelity situations in the non-judgmental way that I do. But at the time, when I was in graduate school, even though the sociology of sexuality is great, the problem was that I was completely miserable. Not just normal graduate school miserable, I was abjectly, wretchedly miserable. I wasn't using any of the sociological insights I shared with you in a way that I found deeply satisfying. I was reading and writing and researching and teaching about all of this kind of stuff. And all of that was important to me in an abstract sense, but I didn't love the actual doing of the day-to-day work I was doing. I had thought that teaching undergraduate sociology was going to be deeply satisfying to me, but as it turned out, I kind of hated it. I didn't always hate it, but I mostly hated it. I had thought that the practice of research was going to be deeply satisfying to me, but it really wasn't. It was important to me, but it wasn't satisfying to me. I wanted to be utilizing the important insights from the sociology of sexuality in some way, but it was becoming increasingly clear that I didn't want to do that through the usual academic channels of teaching and research. And I didn't have a clue what any viable alternatives would actually look like. It was beginning to dawn on me that I wanted to engage with other humans as a practitioner of some kind, but as a practitioner of what exactly? I didn't really know. Even though I was still very much interested in human sexuality and related aspects of human life, I knew I still didn't want to be a sex therapist. I knew I still didn't want to be a sex educator. I wanted something that went beyond those kinds of roles, but I had no idea what that was. So I had this predicament on my hands. I was in this PhD program. I knew I wanted something different professionally from the trajectory I was on, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't have any clear sense of how I might go about figuring it out. So I took the next best step I could come up with at that time. I stuck with my PhD program, and I simultaneously embarked on the path of becoming a holistic health practitioner and a yoga instructor. And the whole holistic health and yoga thing encompassed quite a lot and gave me the opportunity to engage with humans in a very direct and often very intimate way. The school where I received my holistic health practitioner training from offered a very rich, multidisciplinary approach to understanding the human condition. And although the primary emphasis of their teachings was on different massage and bodywork modalities, we really learned how to relate to people, not just as masses of physical matter, although we sure spent a lot of time studying anatomy and physiology, but also as emotional, spiritual, energetic creatures, not just biological creatures. And this provided a really interesting contrast to my sociological work that I was doing. A few days a week, I was working with individuals and helping them work through discomfort in the context of touching their bodies through massage or yoga adjustments or some combination thereof. I was talking to people about their chi or their prana or their vital energy and helping them explore the connections between their emotional experiences of life and their physical experiences of life. And then on the other days of the week, I was dealing with the human experience as a researcher, right? By studying and examining the ways in which knowledge about sexuality is created and transmitted. And I was also teaching too. Yay, fun. So within these two parallel professional lives I was leading, I was learning about and contending with the human experience from a variety of different angles, from a variety of different perspectives, in a variety of different ways. And I really wanted to figure out how to integrate all of this somehow. I wanted to take the parts of what I was doing that I loved and make them even better and marry them in ways that made something beautiful that I couldn't quite envision. And I wanted to drop the parts that I knew I absolutely hated. I knew I didn't want to be a sociologist and a holistic health practitioner. And I definitely didn't want to be a sociologist or a holistic health practitioner. I wanted to selectively pull different pieces of what I was doing from their sources and put them together in a new configuration. But I kept telling myself that I didn't know how to do that. I wanted so badly for someone to come along and see me and say, wow, you have such an interesting educational and professional background. You have all of this training and expertise that could be put together in a really amazing way. And guess what? I see the perfect way to make use of your very unique combination of interests and expertise and passions and capacities. I wanted someone to come along and say, lucky you. I've figured out exactly how you can make use of your interests and expertise in a way that will be really satisfying for you and really helpful for other people. Here's the job description and here's the salary. Are you interested? It might sound funny now, But at the time, this was anything but funny. I spent a really long time believing that this was something that someone had to come along and do for me. I spent a really long time believing that I either didn't have the power or the permission to create my own role for myself. And I see my clients grappling with a version of this a lot. For example, a lot of folks I work with who are married want to retain some of the elements of the relationship they have with their spouse and the relationship they have with their family, but they don't want to be married to their spouse anymore. And they know what they really want. They have a really clear sense of what this new version of their family could be like, and they love the idea of it. But they also don't quite believe that they can have it because they don't see many or any other people living out new versions of their family in the way that they want to. Or sometimes people are just like, I know I want something different, but I don't know exactly what it is. And on the whole, people often think that some kind of magical fairy has to come along and grant them permission to revise their family lives in the way that they want to before they can take any action in the service of actually making these changes. And I get it. I totally get it. Thinking that you need permission to create a new version of your life that deviates from all of the examples of what's possible that you've seen is definitely a thing. And it's okay to want that magical fairy to come along and sprinkle permission dust all over you. But it's another thing to wait for that to happen. And that is part of the reason why I am telling you this story today. I spent years waiting for the magical fairy to come along and give me permission to create a previously unheard of job for myself. It's hard to say exactly how many years I spent waiting for this to happen because I'm not exactly sure how to define when I started waiting for this to happen and when I stopped waiting for this to happen. But by any measure, it was more than 10 years. I spent 10 years of my grown-ass adult life waiting for someone to come along and give me permission to become what I am. I spent 10 years of my life waiting for someone to come along and tell me, guess what? You just have to go for it. I spent 10 years not understanding that nobody was going to come along and give me the magic tap on the head or the secret roadmap towards my desired future. I spent 10 years resisting the idea that I just had to fucking go for it and figure it out. Now, I do want to be clear that I wasn't only sitting around on my ass waiting for someone to give me permission to create a previously unheard of job for myself for 10 plus years. I was doing plenty of things that whole time. But while I was waiting for permission to create this new professional life for myself, I wasn't creating a new professional life for myself, right? Instead of waiting for someone or something to come along and give you permission to change your life, you can get to work on giving yourself permission. And this may take time and effort, and you may need some help. In order to give yourself permission to make changes in your life, you will probably have to change some of your long-held ways of thinking about yourself and your long-held ways of thinking about what's possible. You will probably have to deal with some pretty major self-imposed resistance. You will probably have to deal with some pretty intense emotions. But none of that is bad. It's just part of the glorious experience of being a human. And B, I can help you do these things. It's so much easier when you have a helper to support you. And C, the discomfort that may come with becoming a fuller, truer version of who you are usually feels a lot better than the discomfort of staying stuck in a version of yourself that you know you've outgrown. No matter how hard your infidelity situation seems to deal with, I promise you that taking the bull by the horns and beginning to deal with your infidelity situation one conscious step at a time is so much better than waiting around for a magical fairy to give you permission to do what you want to do or to tell you what you want to do in the first place. Waiting around and believing you are powerless feels terrible. Actually starting to do what you want to do may feel terrible sometimes too, but it's a very different kind of terrible, and you get to move forward while you're feeling terrible. Okay, getting back to my very long story here. I continued my parallel lives in sociology and holistic health and yoga for years, more than 10 years. After I finished my PhD, I got jobs based on my sociological credentials because it seemed like the practical thing to do, and because I was terrified of being an entrepreneur, and because I still didn't quite have a vision of what unique role I would fashion for myself, even if I believed I had the power to create any job for myself that I could. And in case I haven't already made this clear enough, all of this nonsense went on for a long time, living these two parallel lives, being unsatisfied with my professional situation, believing that I didn't have the power to really do anything about this. That shit went on for a long time. And then finally, I got to this point where I had gotten a job based on my sociological skills that I thought should have been good enough for me to be happy enough with. And I had a bit of holistic health work going on the side. And I thought that should be enough for me to be satisfied enough by my professional activities, right? I thought that the combination of things I was doing work-wise would be enough, or should be enough, I should say, to satisfy my desire to be useful in the world in a particular way. I was pretty much telling myself at this time, okay, well, this is probably as good as it gets for me, so I need to be happy with this. But the problem was I was not happy with my work situation at all. Not only was I not happy in my sociological job, I was totally miserable within it. It finally became abundantly clear to me that there was no way I was going to be able to convince myself that I was fine or okay enough with my professional life for any longer. I finally got to the point where I realized that I was going to have to step up to the fucking plate and take responsibility for figuring out a way for me to combine my passions and expertise and capacities into some sort of job for myself that I truly loved, or else I was going to be completely fucked. And by completely fucked, I mean that I would be living a life in which I was miserable professionally and spending all of my time and energy trying to convince myself that I wasn't actually miserable professionally. And once that became clear to me, I couldn't unsee that. And I knew that I had to figure out how I was going to change my professional life if I wanted to effectively save my entire life. I'd spent a long time in I don't know land trying to figure out how to weasel out of taking responsibility for doing the thing I didn't think I could do. But it finally became clear to me that I really did have to do the thing I thought I couldn't do, right? That's a riff on an Eleanor Roosevelt quote, by the way. She talks about how you must do the thing you think you cannot do. And I finally got to the point of accepting that I had to do the thing I thought I couldn't do. I had to configure a professional life for myself that I loved. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I finally accepted that I was either going to have to figure it out or be miserable. And I decided that the latter really wasn't an option for me anymore. So I didn't really know what to do from there. But I decided that I was going to be okay with not knowing And I was also going to open myself up to pursuing and listening to new sorts of messages and new sorts of ways of approaching life's challenges. And guess what? This is more or less when I discovered life coaching. I landed upon Martha Beck's books, and I was like, oh, the kinds of problems she describes other people having are exactly the kinds of problems I'm having. And some of the means of addressing life's problems that she proposed made a lot of sense to me. Some of them made more sense to me than anything I'd heard in a long time. So that was pretty cool. And then I learned that Martha Beck, too, had been a sociologist, and she had abandoned academia to create this totally non-traditional, yet totally wonderful career path for herself. And that was when I started to think, maybe there really is hope for me. Maybe I really can leave my known professional world and step into something different that I really love. And B, maybe I want to be a life coach of some sort. What? That blew my mind. I'm going to conclude part 1 of this story here because this has gotten long enough and I have to conclude part 1 somewhere. In next week's episode, I'll tell you part 2 of the story, which I'm happy to tell you is the story of how things started to get better. It's the story of how I went from having this tiny little idea that maybe I could be this weird thing called a life coach to doing what I do now. And maybe more importantly, it's a story of how I went from being miserable in my professional life and believing that I was essentially stuck being miserable in my professional life to being in love with my professional life. It's a story of how I gave myself permission to have faith in myself and how I gave myself permission to create something that I thought I needed someone else's permission to create. So tune in next week to hear all about that. And in the meantime, if you are ready to resolve your infidelity situation in a way that's truly right for you and you want my help doing it, let's get to work. We can work together intensively one-on-one. And if you want to do that, the first step is to schedule an introductory coaching session with me through the services page of my website. I offer confidential, compassionate coaching via Zoom, which means we can work together no matter where you're located. Or if you want more of my teaching than I can deliver on this podcast, but you like working independently, you can avail yourself of my self-guided course. You're not the only one. You can purchase that through the services page of my website, and you can sign up to work with me one-on-one through the services page of my website too. And that's mariemurphyphd.com/services. Whew. All right, everyone. Thank you all so much for listening. Have a great week. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Your Secret is Safe with Me with Dr. Marie Murphy. Make sure to click subscribe to get updates on our latest episodes.